because the immunotherapy is allowing the patient's own immune system to recognize special elements of the patient's cancers, it's a personalized therapy against the patient's tumor and has the capacity to eliminate and control the cancer for a prolonged period.
There are what we call markers that would say which patients likely to respond or which patient may need a combination of approaches to make this work.
We can manage people through chemotherapy pretty well these days, but combining it with immunotherapy looks really good for many.
Well, actually, I was diagnosed in 2003, given 6 months in 2005, and here I am today.
From the Zoomerplex in historic Liberty Village, the Zoomer with Libby Znaimer.
Welcome to the Zoomer. I'm Libby Znaimer. For decades, doctors have mainly been using surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation to treat cancer patients. But the biggest advance in recent years has been a different type of therapy, immunotherapy. It harnesses the patient's immune system to fight the cancer and is particularly successful in treating skin and lung cancer. It also has great promise with other forms of the disease. How does immunotherapy work, and how has it allowed patients to live longer? We'll discuss that with our panel in a moment, but first, let's tee up the topic.
Over the last few years, immunotherapy has evolved into a very promising new frontier for fighting more than a dozen types of cancer. Still, extended lifespans mean that 1 out of every 2 Canadians will get cancer in their lifetime, and 1 in 4 will die from it. So even if we are among the lucky, somebody close to us has had or will have cancer. Cancer can occur at any age, but about 90% are 50 and older. This means cancer cases will go up, and why efficient, affordable, and sustainable therapies are all the more critical.
So what are the different kinds of immunotherapy exactly, and how is it administered? Let's go to our panel. Hello, let's start with Dr. Bell.
Hi. Well, it's a good question. Immunotherapy is actually a number of different kinds of therapies. And really what it's designed to do is to try to get the patient's immune system to recognize the cancer as a foreign body and then do the work of eliminating the cancer. And so the real dream and value of this approach, if it works, is to really get a very targeted therapy that attacks the cancer and leaves the patient's normal tissues unscathed. That's really the goal of these kinds of therapies, and that's why it seems to be so successful.
And it is particularly successful in lung cancer and melanoma. Dr. Paul Wheatley-Price, why is that?
Thanks for inviting me onto the panel today, Libby. Lung cancer is the most common cancer diagnosed in Canada, nearly 30,000 cases this year. It also kills more Canadians than any other cancer by some stretch. And we know that lung cancer cells, for the majority of people, are highly mutated. So a lot of damage has occurred to cells from carcinogens, primarily tobacco smoke, but there are other causes as well. And what that does is it gives them like they're hot coals in a fire, and you can spot them a mile off. If you're the immune system, you see these hot cells that the immune system can attack. But the problem is that they're wearing a kind of a shield. And I sometimes use the analogy of the Lord of the Rings, where Bilbo Baggins, he has this magic ring, and when he puts on his ring, he becomes invisible. And it's as though these hot coals that should be alive to the immune system are hidden. And this new group of drugs now, these immunotherapy drugs, essentially they take the ring off. So Bilbo is now visible and can be attacked by the orcs, and these hot cancer cells can be attacked by immunotherapy drugs. And we've seen now, the emergence of these drugs into the market, approved and available to Canadians, and transforming lives. So where people may have lived just for a matter of months with lung cancer, we're now seeing them live for many, many years.
Dr. Marcus Butler, can you tell us of some of the other impacts on survival rates?
Well, in melanoma, for instance, chemotherapy and radiation really had limited benefit for patients. And over the last decade, we've been using immunotherapy to treat patients with the immune checkpoint inhibitors that Paul just described. These agents can induce an immune response partly by generating a strong immune response against the cancer and then also taking off the cloak that hides the cancer from the immune system. The current immunotherapy that is showing such excitement, the class of drugs called immune checkpoint inhibitors, is that they relieve the brakes on the immune system. They prevent the cancer from hiding from the immune system so that those mutations are easily recognized by the immune system and you see a clinical response. There are other types of immune therapies that have resulted in approvals, such as the CAR T-cell therapies for leukemias and some lymphomas. In that case, we engineer a cell so that it can recognize the patient's tumor. We start with the patient's normal immune cells, we engineer those cells, and then they're infused as a treatment. In melanoma, we use combination immunotherapy where patients get two drugs at the same time. There are issues with side effects in some patients, but we can get quite strong immune responses where patients have their tumor disappear. They may not need to continue on this immune therapy, but actually will survive for many years without any relapse. We're now actually using medications, usually in monotherapy, for patients who are at high risk of relapse to prevent cancer from coming back. And that's now part of standard of care in melanoma.
Kathy Barnard, you've been a patient. What's your experience?
Well, actually, I was diagnosed in 2003, given 6 months in 2005, and here I am today. I had 4 treatments. My last in 2007 was one of the newer immuno-oncology. So I think the success is pretty good.
Yeah, looks good. When we come back, applying immunotherapy to different cancer protocols. That's next.
Patients who complete a course of therapy can continue living out their lives without continued treatment.
Welcome back. Before the advent of immunotherapy, advanced melanoma, the deadliest form of skin cancer, was virtually a death sentence. Now, 88% of Canadian patients survive for at least 5 years. It's also been successful in treating lung cancer. Let's get a sense of the importance of these breakthroughs. Dr. Butler.
Well, the immunotherapy, as you mentioned, was that's been developed over the last 10 years with the immune checkpoint inhibitors has really made a big difference in patients' lives. The most important thing is that because the immunotherapy is allowing the patient's own immune system to recognize special elements of the patient's cancers, it's a personalized therapy against the patient's tumor and has the capacity to eliminate and control the cancer for a prolonged period. So that means that patients who complete a course of therapy can continue living out their lives without continued treatment. There is quite a variation in terms of patients. Some patients will have a kind of a home run where they have a treatment and then don't require further treatments. Other patients, however, may have a more chronic condition where they're requiring multiple treatments for over the years for patients. And most importantly, clinical trials are continuing to help the proportion of patients who are dealing with progressive disease. Unfortunately, we are losing patients to resistance, and this is continuing to be a challenge. But scientists such as Dr. Bell and others are developing new strategies to help our patients.
You know, I have kind of an interesting story about that. My husband and I have a friend, and he was diagnosed with melanoma, bad melanoma, just before immunotherapy was approved. And he ended up going to Germany and swearing by these whatever treatments, infusions, but he had a recurrence. And when he had the recurrence, he got the immunotherapy, and it was very tough on him. For a while, he ended up in a wheelchair, but, you know, knock wood, he's fine now.
Yeah, that is a common story for many patients, yes.
It seems quite incredible. And Kathy, I know that you had an earlier form of immunotherapy, which was much harder on your body.
Yeah, I started with interferon actually. Back in 2003, did that for a full year. So had every gamut of side effects with that one. Then the cancer came back to my lung, liver, bone, adrenal gland, and kidney. There was nothing else available for me at that time, so went on a chemotherapy, dacarbazine, but that didn't work. And then actually did Proleukin. The doctors can correct me, but I think that was maybe an older immuno-oncology. But the side effects of that for me were horrific.
Like what?
Everything. I felt like I was burning from the outside in. I had very little control of my body functions. I think I code blued in the last dosing cycle. It was extremely difficult.
From what I gather, that wasn't that unusual with those particular drugs.
No, but I got through it and actually had a complete response for about 6 months. And then when the cancer came back into my small digestive tract, by then I was able to get the first immuno-oncology, the newer model, I call it, by compassionate use in 2007.
Wow. Congratulations, by the way. Dr. Bell, I know with other forms of therapy, chemotherapy or targeted therapies, a lot of it is genetic, and doctors can figure out which drug will work in which person according to their genetic makeup. Is there anything equivalent with immunotherapy?
That's a huge area of investigation, and it's really encouraging because I think we're starting to see there are what we call markers that would say which patient is likely to respond or which patient may need a combination of approaches to make this work. So just like any other cancer therapy, that sort of investigation is really critical because we're all different. You know, we all look different, and our cancers will all be different as well. So it's important to really get that profiling to understand who may respond to a particular therapy or not. And there is never going to be one drug for everyone. We need to have combinations, as Marcus was mentioning, to really deal with this disease.
How far along are you with that? Do you have any inkling now, or because there are a bunch of different kinds of immunotherapy drugs?
That's absolutely true. There's quite a few, and they're quite diverse. As I say, they all have the same goal, but some are based upon cell products. So you may take the cells out of a patient, their immune cells, and re-engineer them and fuse them back in. Some are, you may harvest immune cells right from the tumor itself and grow them up and put them back in. And the immune checkpoints that Paul and Marcus were talking about, again, another class, but they're all working towards the same goal of giving this personalized therapy against the cancer and hopefully to establish a memory so that the cancer won't come back.
Dr. Wheatley-Price, I know there are different kinds of lung cancer, so does this work better for some as opposed to others, or is that not the issue at all?
No, you're exactly right. Immunotherapy, as we've been talking about, has been a huge advance in a number of cancers, but not in all. And lung cancer is not really one disease. It's now really a selection of multiple different types of lung cancer. And immunotherapy works extremely well in some, and in others it doesn't work at all. But we do have the ability now to identify those where it's most likely to work. And one of the great things is when we can identify that. So if you go back to that initial analogy of hot coals, those cancer cells are the hottest brightest hot colds that we can reach, we're now seeing people live for many years, and for them, we're turning this into a chronic disease. The challenge that I think has been alluded to is those other types of lung cancer or other cancers where those colds, those cancer cells have gone cold a bit, and they're not so readily visible to the immune system. How can we, with new combinations or new treatments, how can we kind of heat those up so those cancer cells go from being cold to hot, and then suddenly the immune system can activate on them as well? So we're making lung cancer a chronic disease for some, but not yet for enough.
Just before we go, very quickly, so which kinds of lung cancer does it work well for?
So we look for a chemical marker, a biomarker called PD-L1. And in about 1/3 of people with non-small cell lung cancer, which is the most common type, about 1/3 will have very high levels of PD-L1, and we can use immunotherapy with good confidence. For people, the 2/3 where there are lower levels of PD-L1, we can still use immunotherapy with reasonable confidence, but we have to combine it with traditional chemotherapy. And chemotherapy is not the horror show these days that we might imagine. So if there was someone listening who was thinking, oh no, I'm going to have to get chemotherapy, that's not so bad. We can manage people through chemotherapy pretty well these days, but combining it with immunotherapy looks really good for many.
Okay. When we come back, can immunotherapy be harnessed for other hard-to-treat cancers? That's next.
Colon cancer is a good example of a disease that most of the colon cancers don't respond to these standard checkpoint inhibitors, but there's a subset that does.
Welcome back. Thanks to immunotherapy, some patients with hard-to-treat cancers like lung cancer are living longer and better. Researchers are constantly testing its use in other cancers. So what is the progress on that? Dr. Bell, I am sure that a few years ago, when I was on the board of Pancreatic Cancer Canada, we funded some of your research. But as far as I know, there's not been really great progress on using immunotherapy in pancreatic cancer.
There hasn't been yet, but there's a lot of excitement in that area. There's new approaches to try to, as Paul mentioned, basically these cancers are very stealth. They're very good at hiding. And so there's new strategies for making them more visible. One is, for instance, to use therapeutic viruses to infect the pancreatic cancer and then make it become visible to the immune system. Other people are doing studies. There's one open in Toronto where they're using particular antibodies to target antigens which are known to be on the cancer itself, and then use that in combination with things like the immunotherapies Paul is referring to. So this is beginning to happen, not as fast as we all want, of course, but it is certainly, there's a lot of activity in that area.
Well, there are a lot of theories as to why pancreatic cancer has been ineffective. You will often hear people talking about cold and hot tumors, where a cold tumor is one where we don't see any immune recognition of the cancer. I think our concepts of tumors that are ineffectively treated by immunotherapy has developed more. In pancreatic cancer, for instance, while we don't completely understand all of the mechanisms, it does appear that the tumor microenvironment is hostile to an effective immune response. There are actually immune cells within the pancreas, the pancreatic cancer, which actively inhibit the activity of the killer T cells that can target the tumor. So we need to not only help the immune response recognize a cancer, but we also have to fight against the suppressive elements of the immune system that prevent an effective immune response.
What are some of the other cancers that are, being targeted for immunotherapy, Dr. Butler?
Well, actually, almost every single cancer that exists is people want to try to see if immunotherapy is effective. And the big challenge has been in recent years finding diseases that will be treatable with these agents. I think there has been a lot of excitement about combination immune checkpoint inhibitors, but that hasn't really hit as many home runs in recent years as we were seeing about 5 to 6 years ago. Recently, just this week, there's been a report of a rare type of melanoma that comes from the eye, responding to a therapy that is a bispecific molecule. It's kind of a matchmaker that brings T cells to the tumor. And in a randomized clinical trial, more people are alive at 1 year compared to patients who receive standard of care. Other types of cancers that are having active interest and are near having approvals or have been approved include Hodgkin's disease, bladder cancer, gastric cancer, esophageal cancer. There's interest certainly in breast cancer and colon cancer. Colon cancer is a good example of a disease that most of the colon cancers don't respond to these standard checkpoint inhibitors, but there's a subset that does, and that biomarkers might identify those patients who respond well to these therapies.
So is it a question of picking a cancer by the part of the body that it attacks, or are you looking for all of them that, say, have that PDL marker that might respond?
Well, certainly PDL1 is a helpful marker, but it does depend on the particular tumor microenvironment and the type of tumor, where in some cases the PDL1 is a better marker than in other cases. And definitely there are differences between different types of cancers and the way the immune system interacts with those cancers. Basic research is really critical in helping us to understand the Achilles heel of the tumor so that we can use the immune system effectively. There are, another really good example are the cell therapies, the CAR T cell therapies and other types of gene engineered cell therapies. These tumors are not typically recognized by the immune system at all, but we can engineer the immune system to very effectively target and eliminate cancers from, in some cases, for these patients.
Kathy Barnard, you're the CEO of the Save Your Skin Foundation, and cancer patients with metastatic cancer, with cancer that's spread, are a whole other subset, and it's considered terminal. So what effect has immunotherapy had on this particular community of people? Has it really increased hope, or maybe even a different way of viewing the diagnosis?
Absolutely. When we first started the foundation, there was very little hope in 2006 for metastatic melanoma patients, very little. And by 2012 and 13, we were starting to talk about hope. And even over the last couple of years, we now talk about survivorship. Most of us that have been out of the 5-year mark wouldn't say cured. I think we're always a little nervous to think we are. So we call ourselves survivors. We live with melanoma. That's just the nature of our life now. But I mean, when we first started the foundation, we were saying very few survive in this disease, and now we're seeing more. I'd like to see all, and hopefully the 3 gentlemen on the panel with me, I'll make that happen. But for us as patients, it's pretty exciting time, especially in melanoma for us.
Okay. There's more after the break. Stick around.
The time frame taken from when we know a drug is effective based on results of clinical trials to actually getting them into the clinic and funded for all Canadians does take sometimes a couple of years. And so there's a lot of work to do.
Welcome back. When it comes to immunotherapy, the question is, do all Canadian patients have access? So what is approved and covered, and where? Dr. Wheatley-Price?
So this is a challenge for us to make sure that we get these exciting new drugs into the clinics everywhere. And the Canadian landscape is throwing up some challenges for that because we have a provincial healthcare system, so each province will make its own budgetary decisions. So there are national frameworks and national applications called a Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review, where new drugs are submitted for approval. And that's for all provinces outside of Quebec, which has its own system called INES. Largely, I think we do ultimately get the effective drugs into the clinic, and in the cases where the benefit is very borderline, there's a bit more to and fro and debating this. One of the challenges, though, is that they are expensive drugs, and the time frame taken from when we know a drug is effective based on results of clinical trials to actually getting them into the clinic and funded for all Canadians does take sometimes a couple of years. And so there's a lot of work to do, which groups like Save Your Skin, which Kathy is leading, and Lung Cancer Canada and others really advocate for changes to streamline these processes and to make it consistent so that Canadians, regardless of your postcode, can access the newest treatments.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a struggle for all cancer drugs. Dr. Butler, in terms of the cost, how big a barrier is that? I know with cancer drugs, one of the things that you have to show before they get listed is that they are economically viable.
That is a major issue for our patients. The big first-line standard of care treatments are available for patients in Canada. We have Health Canada approval for all of the really effective drugs that are being used in melanoma, for instance, that are approved in the FDA. So there's no big difference between us and Europe and Canada, and the US. What does become an issue is, as Paul just mentioned, are the situations where there's a gray zone. We may have very small clinical trials that suggest that one combination therapy is effective in patients who received monotherapy and didn't have a response. There's some indication that there might be some benefit, but we don't know what the magnitude of that benefit is. And the drugs are extremely expensive, up to $100,000 for a course of treatment. So what we're left with now in these situations is finding appropriate clinical trials for patients to provide them with additional options and trying to get access to these drugs as the data is built to make the case for provincial funding in these scenarios.
And is there a limit? So I remember years ago, the maximum the province would pay was something like $80,000 for an extra year of life, something like that. Is it now $100,000, or is there no specific number?
I'm not aware that, well, I know that there's a framework, and I think Dr. Wheatley-Price can probably speak to that what the current the thinking is. But in the Pan Oncology review process, there is an economic assessment, and and modeling to try to see what is cost effective. One of the big important differences between immunotherapy and standard chemotherapy is that we have something that we call the tail of the curve. So the drug that Kathy had is a good example. This was a drug which actually provided a very minimal benefit for most patients, but about 15 to 20% of patients had a home run where the disease didn't relapse and the patients do really, really well for a decade plus. And that tail of the curve is extremely valuable for those patients, and therefore the modeling that goes into deciding whether a drug should be paid for or not has had to change, because we're not talking about most of the patients just getting a few months extra of life. We're talking about a few patients who get a substantial amount of life addition.
I was going to ask about that, because I know that with other drugs, there are also benchmarks. So a new drug that costs a fortune, say, might give somebody a few extra weeks of life. And the authorities have to decide if that's worth it. Is there a similar, I mean, you're saying that because immunotherapy can work really, really well for some people, it's just a very different kind of discussion?
Yeah, that's right. And then one of the challenges also is that it's based on modeling, because we can't predict what's going to happen in 20 years. We can estimate what's going to happen, but the funders are, and I think they have been working with the pharmaceuticals and with the investigators that are seeing these really good results. But it is required a different scheme for evaluating the drugs.
Okay, up next, where is immunotherapy going? Stay tuned.
Engineering cells, so we can make cells that can specifically target a patient's cancer in a very personalized way. That's now being taken to another level where people will say, well, can we create a cell that is a generic type of cell that can be used in multiple patients and still get the outcomes we want?
Welcome back. The field of immunotherapy is exploding with new ways to target cancers. So what are the most promising avenues? Dr. Bell?
There's a lot of excitement, to be honest. I think this is really a great time for immunotherapy because we're beginning to see new strategies for developing approaches to treating cancer patients. So for instance, as Marcus mentioned, engineering cells, so we can make cells that can specifically target a patient's cancer in a very personalized way. That's now being taken to another level where people will say, well, can we create a cell that is a generic type of cell that can be used in multiple patients and still get the outcomes we want? That should drive down costs. I think the vaccines we've been hearing about for COVID from Pfizer and BioNTech, great technology. That technology is now being developed for cancer treatment too, to develop strategies to personalize therapy for cancer patients in a combination effect of the vaccine plus other kinds of therapies like we've been talking about. The PDL,
are you talking about the RNA messenger?
That's right. So that technology is being done, and so the beauty of that is one can find out exactly what is mutated, as Paul mentioned, in the patient, which actual antigens are, and then encode it in that messenger RNA, and then use that to vaccinate in a very personalized fashion for that particular cancer. So that's exciting. It's coming down the road. It's not there yet, but we're starting to see some really positive things from that. And then, other kinds of, every day we're understanding more about this tumor environment and how to manipulate it so we can get the immune system to work better.
You mentioned COVID, and I do have a question about that, and that is, how is COVID affecting things when it comes to treatment with immunotherapy? Dr. Marcus, you talked about clinical trials. Are they still on throughout COVID?
Well, we did have a reduction in our clinical trial volume in the spring, but we're back up at about the levels that overall that we were previously, and we're doing our best to keep that option open for patients. The biggest challenge we have with skin oncology is the fact that patients are not having their skin cancers diagnosed. There's been a substantial reduction in the number of cases being diagnosed in Ontario compared to prior year because patients aren't seeing their dermatologist or their family doctor and having biopsies. That has resulted in some anecdotal experience of having patients presenting with more advanced disease than they would have in the past. In terms of what's next for immunotherapy, we have new types of drugs that are entering into late phase clinical development and are showing promise. And more importantly, we're taking these new drugs and applying them to patient treatments earlier in the course of disease. In the past, for immunotherapy, we basically waited until patients had stage 4 disease. Now we're treating patients with stage 3 disease as standard of care. And clinical trials in melanoma are investigating whether stage 2 is an appropriate time for treating with immunotherapy. So by treating patients earlier, we're able to avoid the more toxic treatments, and patients hopefully will have less need for additional surgeries and other therapies down the road.
Kathy Barner, what are you doing to advocate for more trials and more coverage of drugs and moving it along to more first-line therapy?
Well, that's actually a lot of what we do at Save Your Skin is advocating for equal timely access. The 2 drugs that I got, the one in 05 and 07, I actually had to travel outside of my jurisdiction to get those treatments. And as you can imagine, when you've been diagnosed with a metastatic cancer disease, the last thing you want to do is leave your home, your province, and your support system. So it's always been really important for us. But the other thing I want to say too, though, is in Canada, as a patient, we get an opportunity to be part of the drug approval process. So when we see a drug, a new treatment coming into the melanoma space, we can reach out to cancer patients, melanoma patients that have had melanoma, and even maybe had that treatment in a clinical trial process, and we get to use their voice in the process. So we are heard. In melanoma, we always felt we were the back of the bus, and now we feel we are literally driving the bus in cancer. We are working with patient advocacy groups in every cancer indication now to share best practices and really work together to help change the landscape for Canadians dealing with cancer.
Dr. Wheatley-Price, what's the view of that with lung cancer?
I think I would echo a lot of the comments that you've just heard. There's a lot of promise for immunotherapy. So I would say, firstly, we're seeing new indications. So in the lung cancer world, I also treat a rare form of lung cancer called mesothelioma, which is the lining of the lung. And we recently learned just in the last month or 2 that immunotherapy is substantially better than chemotherapy, particularly in some of the hardest mesotheliomas to treat. And then, like as Dr. Butler just said, we're now able to give immunotherapy at earlier stages of the disease. So at stage 4, we're still really talking about helping people to live longer than they would have with previous treatments, but not necessarily a cure. But now if we move it up to people who have curable disease and are having surgery or radiotherapy to try and cure their lung cancer, if we give immunotherapy after that, we know we significantly bump up the cure rate. So there's a lot of promise, and we share these challenges of making sure that we can get these great new things actually into the clinic where it's needed.
Does this kind of mean that immunotherapy has come of age? Because that's the same trajectory that you have with other chemotherapy drugs. First, they're tried on people who are terminal, and then it moves up through the chain.
For sure, it's come of age now. And maybe I'll tell you a story about a guy called Don, and he's happy for me to share his name. I met him in the clinic with a new diagnosis of stage 4 lung cancer, probably about 5 years ago now. He was in a wheelchair on an oxygen tank. He couldn't finish a sentence for coughing and gasping for breath. He initially had chemotherapy, felt great, did really well, walked into the clinic 3 weeks later. That lasted for about a year. He then went on to immunotherapy. That was 4 years ago. He's not needed an infusion for about 2 years. I saw him yesterday in his Hawaiian shirt, and he's doing just great. And I see people like that in my clinic, every week. So this has come of age. We've now got to make it come of age for everyone.
Well, it's always nice to hear stories like that. When we come back, final thoughts. Don't go away. Welcome back to theZoomer. It's time for final thoughts. We'll start with Dr. Marcus Butler.
Well, I'm really excited about the potential for immunotherapy for patients. We see it every day in our clinics in patients with success. I am, challenged by patients where we need to do further work, But I think we really have an opportunity through research and investment to make a major difference in patients' lives and in treating them with this approach.
Kathy Barnard.
Couldn't agree more. Every day is a new day in melanoma, and the treatments we're seeing coming to the landscape. So keep up the good work, gentlemen, and we're counting on you.
Dr. John Bell.
Yeah, you know, when I started my career, immunotherapy was really a dirty word. No one believed it was even possible to use immunotherapy to treat this disease. And now, as Marcus points out and Paul, we're seeing tremendous outcomes. Again, not in enough patients yet, but I believe through more research and more support of that effort, we are going to see this as a major player in treating patients, especially, as was suggested, if we can treat them earlier in their disease, where their immune system is already healthy. I think that we'll see a much better outcomes.
Dr. Wheatley Price.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on the panel. I think you've heard all you need to hear, really. Immunotherapy has completely changed the landscape. And lung cancer has a very poor overall survival rate historically, and we're seeing that really start to steadily climb now, and in no small part thanks to immunotherapy.
Immunotherapy is the most important advance in cancer treatment in recent memory, and we're just beginning to understand the promise it holds. Thank you to my panelists and to our audience. That's all the time we have. Be well and stay safe, and it's time to zoom out.